Okay, so welcome back to the second week of this particular course, which is on life cycle assessment. In this week, we will be, as I said, towards the end of last week, the last set of last video that you saw, we will look at some of these risk assessment concept and how it relates to the life cycle. And as you know, for every week we have 5 videos of 30 minutes each. So this we again will start with the first modules of the second week, and where we'll cover the basics of the risk assessment. So next around 30 minutes, I will try to give you a brief overview of what is the risk assessment and how it is done. And we'll have it. I think there is another video will come up later on. We'll look at it in some details, but here we'll cover the basics. So as you already, I don't have to kind of say that again. You already have got an idea in the week one that sustainability issues are complex, and understanding of the interaction of the complexity, as you saw towards the last week, water, food, energy, they are all complex, and it's an equally complex engineered system. So, and understanding their interaction is very important, and that's what we do by coming up with some analysis framework. We have been talking about environmental health, human health, but when you do this environmental health and human health, one of the important concept is the risk assessment concept. So when I say something is bad, how bad it is, what is the risk from that, whether it's a affordable risk, whether it's a manageable risk, or whether it's an unmanageable risk. So we have to come up with risk-based framework to characterize as well as to prioritize the environmental issues. And this, again, when we try to do that, we use life cycle frameworks. We use the life cycle frameworks in terms of characterizing and understanding sustainability, which you will see in this particular week during the discussion in this week. So what is risk? So risk is defined as the potential for an individual to suffer an adverse effect of an event. And the concept of risk is used in all analysis. Those of you who are familiar with financial, you hear that financial risk assessment or financial risk, and you talk about the share market. Many times you hear that share market, these shares are, let's say, it's a risky share, like a high risk, high gain, or low risk, low gain kind of, where this is really a good company. You invest here, the return will be there, but may not be very high. Some companies are there which will give you a lot of return, but then at the same time you have a chance that you may end up losing your money. So that's the concept used in the finance. In engineering risk, we talk about in engineering a risk as well, when we design like a road safety issues, any issues that you have some risk associated with that. Essentially, the potential for an individual to suffer an adverse effect from an event. There is a health risk. So, and the precise definition of risk can vary depending on the application. So in terms of understanding the language of risk and the tools to quantify the risk and the use of risk in the regulation, so we have to understand the risk framework and how it can be potentially employed for environmental and sustainability issues. So that's what we will try to look at as part of this this particular module. So here again, a lot of slides. Since you will be getting a PDF version of these slides, I have left those text in there. But you don't have to try to worry too much about kind of reading those tests right now while you are listening to this video. Its environmental risk can be grouped into 3 general categories, and you just look at those bold points that has been made here. One is the risk involving voluntary exposure. So that's where you do it voluntarily. Say you want to go for a bungee jumping, and the bungee jumping, skydiving, mountain climbing, those things, these are the risks. You know the risk is there, and risk is obvious, but you want to take it. It's your free will to do that. But then there are risks associated with natural disaster. There could be flood, there could be earthquake, hurricanes, and some kind of meteorite hits, other disaster. These are beyond our control in a direct sense. And there could be some exposure to certain natural disaster, and this is what may happen. So that's the risk associated with natural disaster, as very self-explanatory. Then risk involving involuntary exposure. That's what we are kind of talk about when you're talking about chemicals released in the environment. When we are talking about different air pollutants, those are involuntarily. Say you and me doesn't want to inhale toxic fumes in the gas, in the air, but so, or like in say in a industrialized towns, the towns with big lot of vehicles, especially the metropolitan towns in the country. If you go to Delhi, gets a lot of news on air pollution issues. So if you are living in Delhi, you don't really want to inhale those toxic fumes or toxic chemicals which is present in the air there. But the problem is you don't have any other option. You have to inhale and exhale to survive, and to inhale you will get all these potential harming chemicals in there. So that's your involuntary exposure. Same thing, think about the workers working in the industry. Those who are working in an industrial setting which has a lot of chemicals, things being released into the environment because of some leakages and other stuff, and then they are exposed to it. So, and we cannot have directly control on the exposure, because we can put some mask and other stuff, but even after that there will be some exposure. So that's what those are our involuntary exposure from risk coming from there. So that, and how this involuntary exposure comes, because of the release of chemicals to the environment, and the chemicals gets released to the environment because of the release to the atmosphere, release to surface water, release to land. And when we talk about the environmental risk, it is the function of hazard and exposure. So if you write a mathematical equation for environmental risk, it will be a function, hazard and exposure are your two variables. So if some chemicals are there, it's a very high hazard potential, but the exposure level is very low, you may have less environmental risk. But at the same time, some chemicals are there which has a hazard potential, like a medium level hazard potential, but the exposure is very high. So you are exposed to it say 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day, then your risk is pretty higher from that, even although the hazard is not that high, because it's a function of the two. It's the hazard as well as the exposure. That's how your environmental risk is calculated. So risk is the likelihood, again as we said earlier, likelihood of a harm. It could be both short term as well as the long term. If you have read any of these books, you know the short term we call acute and the long term we call chronic. So it could be both acute as well as chronic. There could be, and there is a chronic effects, and the effects on human health and the quality of human life, also the ecological systems, economic systems, because if you have if you have a unhealthy workforce, you will have an unhealthy economy. Your work hours will go down, and you will have an impact on your economic system as well. So the risk assessment, what we do, we use a process by which the form, dimension, and the characteristics of the risk are estimated. And I think the week, this particular week on the third module, you will see some of the details of how that is done. And we utilize both qualitative as well as the quantitative approach. If you don't understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative is with the numbers. Qualitative is where you have a feeling of whether it's a good or a bad, but you cannot say the numbers associated with that. So many times we want, if we cannot have qualitative information is good, but we would like to have quantitative information more than qualitative ones. And then once you assess the risk, you have to manage the risk. Sometimes you cannot really, what you can say, you cannot really take out the risk. So you cannot really remove the risk from there. So, but whatever is the risk, you are trying to manage it. You are trying to control it. You are trying to reduce it as much as possible. And it's a regulatory decision. Risks are based on regulatory decisions. There are, if it's a cancer, say if some of the risk, for example, from arsenic or from cyanide, from other stuff, if it's a cancerous, carcinogen, benzene, for example, if it is a cancer endpoint, usually we use a risk of 1 in a million. So we want to go down to the level. So for example, arsenic drinking water standard is 10 micrograms per liter right now. Earlier it was 50 micrograms per liter, but with better science, we have reduced the drinking water limit to 10 micrograms per liter right now. So the 10 micrograms per liter is based on the principle of 1 in a million cancer risk. Now what does that mean? That means that if our drinking water has less than equal to 10 microliter per, like a 10 micrograms per liter, and if somebody is consuming that water throughout its life, there is a chance of 1 out of a million population that person will have a cancer because of this. Since the cancer can happen with many other factors as well, but just from the arsenic exposure, there is a chance of 1 in a million. That's based on some of the work that is done with some other species like rat, guinea pigs, and all those mice, and then you extrapolate, you do some statistical analysis, and you do and extrapolate those values. There are epidemiological bases for human risk calculation as well. If you have the epidemiological data means data from exposed population. In case of arsenic, we have the exposed population in Bangladesh, we have the exposed population in part of West Bengal, we have the exposed population in Vietnam, Taiwan, and several other countries. So we can get the data from there, that's from the real like the real field data, and we can correlate, we can see how our lab data fits with the field data, and then we can learn from that, and we can come up with a better risk assessment of that. Animal testing is done, as I said earlier, where human data is unavailable. Most data are animal testing data, except in those rare situations where human exposure event has been documented. And where you have this human exposure event documented, that's called your epidemiological data. There are risk is there and everywhere. There is a reference point, as I said, it's 1 in a million, below which USDA does not consider risk from a food additive to be a concern. If it's a minimal risk, is considered 10 to the power of minus 10 to 10 to the power of minus 12. That's a minimal risk. Very high risk is 1 to 0.01. So 0.01 to 1 is considered high risk. And there are risks associated with different aspects. Like if you take shower in a tub, drowning in a tub per year, it's around 10 to the power of minus 5 to 10 to the power minus 6. Similar to death in an airplane crash. So we do hear from time to time the airplane has crashed, but the risk is pretty low based on the aeroplane technology as of today. Automobile accident, it depends on which place you are, but automobile accident, as you hear in Indian context, a lot of people die. In every day we have people dying because of the automobile accident. It's around 1.7 10 to the power of minus 4. Death by lightning 10 to the power minus 3 to minus 4. Again, death of from smoking 1 pack of cigarette per day, 3.6 times 10 to the power of minus 3. So as you go down, you see different cancer for 1 liter of beer per day for a year. Cancer for 1 peanut butter sandwich. Peanut butter sandwich, actually many people in the world, especially in the Western world, they have peanut butter allergy. So that kind of leads to that. Cancer from charbroiled steak. Cancer from drinking water with 80 microgram per liter of CHCl3 per day. So there are, as you can see, there are different risks out there which people are used. The basic principle of risk assessment is, well, first of all, we need to determine the probability that an adverse effect will be produced, and all human activities will have some risk, concerned mostly with the risk from exposure to chemicals. That's what we are following up. Then risk assessment in terms of the extended definition, it's a methodological approach where your chemical exposure are identified. You look at the analysis for the dose response relationship, and then you try to quantify. How we do that? You calculate the amount of chemicals absorbed into the human body, then compare the absorbed dose with the EPA safe dose for non-carcinogen. For non-carcinogen, it is a reference dose. EPA does not recognize a safe dose for carcinogen, so any level of exposure has some cancer risk from there. So risk-specific dose is used to EPA to expose. So basically, based on if you know what is the chemical absorbed into the human body, and then for the non-carcinogens, if we know what is the safe dose, we can calculate, we can find out what is the risk. For carcinogen, again, we have a risk-specific dose is used for EPA to expose to come up with the risk factor. This is a typical curve which you may have seen in your previous some of the courses as well. It's called dose response curve. As you can see from the bottom of this curve over here on the x-axis, you start from 0, and the line of kind of gets up. After this threshold dose, you see the increasing effect showing up. So initially there is no effect up to this point. So no effect up to this point means you keep, that's called the no effect region. And many times you hear the term novel, no observed effect level, and then this will be your first, like when you start seeing effect, and then your effect goes up, 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 and up, and then you have a maximum effect. And after this, even if you keep on increasing the dose, your effect does not go up. So it could be the final, it could be what is the maximum effect it could have. So in the middle is what is the range of increasing effect with increasing dose. So as you increase the dose, effect goes up. So here you can also calculate at what concentration you will have 50% of the inhibition, 20% inhibition, all those things can be done on that with this data. Usually this data is generated from testing those like lab species which we talked about earlier. So this is your typical dose response curve. It is also known as S curve because of the shape of the curve. And this is used a lot in terms of risk assessment for both carcinogen and non-carcinogen. In the history of epidemiology, only a few environmental agents have been repeated. So linked to the human cancer. For example, cigarette smoke. There is a lot of data on cigarette smoke, alcohol, ionizing radiation, some drugs, some occupational carcinogen like asbestos, solvent, benzene, some virus like hepatitis B, human T cell, leukemia virus, human papilloma virus. So these are some of the viruses, some of the stuff from the cancer risk which has been reported. So you will have some of the epidemiological data associated with that. So many epidemiologists require enough increased risk by a factor of 3 to take new cancer risk seriously. So anything more than 3, they take it seriously. Anything less than 3, we don't take it seriously anymore. So for example of risk, high cholesterol diet, and you see here gender in the middle. For male, high cholesterol diet, there is a risk ratio of 1.65 for the colon cancer. Very fat diet, it's for the female around risk ratio of 2 for the breast cancer. Vasectomy, there is a chance of 1.6 for the prostate cancer. If you have a tap water with chlorine 3.3 liters per day, you have 2 to 4 risk ratio for the bladder like a cancer risk. Psychological stress for both male and female 5.5, that may lead to your colon and rectal cancer. High saturated fat diet, again you will have for the female 6, for the non-smokers, for the lung it can have a lung issues. Red meat 5 times a week for both male and female, there is a chance of 2.5 is the risk ratio. This should be 2.5 should show up over here, and the colon is the site. So this got switched a little bit on that side. So that's your so these are some of the risk ratios, just to give you some examples of different risk from the different stuff. So in terms of the risk definitions, there is a applied dose. You saw the dose response curve. So applied dose is the amount of chemical in a medium that is available for uptake. So how much chemical is available. Absorbed dose is the amount that chemical gets absorbed. Whatever chemical you apply doesn't get absorbed. So that's why when you take a medicine, say if you get a prescription drugs and you go and buy this medicine, you have a 100 mg tablet, 600 mg tablet, your body may just require say 10 mg or 60 mg, but you're using a 100 mg tablet or 600 mg tablet because only part of it will get absorbed in the body, rest of it will just go out of the system. So related to the fraction of the applied dose that is absorbed, need to consider route of exposure. You can have an ingestion, you can take the food through that, the medicine, the skin, that's another way you can get some absorbed. You can have exposure to certain chemicals, inhalation, when you inhale something. So the reference dose is the dose of a non-carcinogen that is believed to be safe for human. So you take the animal toxicity data and then you extrapolate it to human using some statistics with that. Now we have risk specific dose, the dose at which 1 person in a million exposed will develop cancer, that's for the carcinogen. You have a 1 in a million cancer risk. Then we calculate hazard index, which is the ratio of absorbed dose to the RFD. If the hazard index is less than or equal to 1, it's okay, it's an acceptable situation. If the hazard index is greater than 1, that means the chemical concentration needs to be decreased. So that's where the risk management comes in picture, where we have to factor this risk assessment and then look at, okay, what are the possible alternative action? How much chemical exposure can be reduced? And what will be the cost associated with that? What is the cost benefit considerations associated with that? What is the need for the consumer alternative chemicals. So then how best to regulate exposure to the chemicals? Should we have a better personal protective equipment? Sometimes it may not be possible to reduce some of those chemicals in a factory setting. So in that case, you will probably use a better personal protective equipment, so that you as a worker think they are not get exposed to it. So in terms of the risk assessment process at site with, say, for the drinking water, first thing we need to do is to find out what is the hazard, what chemicals are present, and what is the concentration of the chemical. So towards the end of this week, towards the later part of this week, I'll tell you how we can analyze for these chemicals and how we look at this concentration and some of the statistics associated with that. So the first thing for any of these risk assessment processes in terms of, okay, what is the hazard, what chemicals are present, at what concentration, whether it's a carcinogen, non-carcinogen. Then you try to come up with that dose response curve with the animal data, mostly with the animal study data, and you come up with the dose response relationship. Probably you may have to repeat the experiments for the data validation, compare the data. If it's similar chemicals has been studied elsewhere, compare the results, discover the RFD or the RSD data from the animal studies, which would be used. Then once you have the animal data, you need to make some assumption, because in the absence of epidemiological data, we need to take the animal data and extrapolate it to humans. So for example, in the drinking water scenario, we need to make some exposure assumption. Important exposure assumption, okay, could be that how much water an adult will take per day. Say upon an average 2 liters per day. Adult weight around 70 kg. Assume that water has 0.5 milligrams per liter of zinc in the drinking water. So 0.5 milligrams per liter per zinc, 0.5 milligrams per liter of zinc in the drinking water, an adult consuming 2 liters per day with his weight or with his or her weight being around 70 kg. So we can calculate the dose where you have whatever is the load coming in, 0.5 milligrams per liter multiplied by 2 liters, that's the amount of zinc that goes into the system through the drinking water source, divided by 70 kg is the weight. So in terms of this liter will go away. So you have around 0.0143 milligram of zinc per kilogram body weight per day. So then we need to see whether it's we need to compare this number with the reference dose number, which has already been for most of the non-carcinogen, you will find the data already available at certain websites, EPA and other regulatory websites. Then you can do the risk estimation. So compare the dose to RFD, cleanup required if the risk is greater than 1 in a million for cancer, or hazard index is greater than or equal to 1 for non-cancer. For zinc, for example, RFD is 0.2, it's a non-carcinogen. So you try to find out hazard index. So 0.2 is safe. The dose you are providing is 0.0143. Number comes out to a 0.0715. So the hazard index is less than 1. So no cleanup is required. So water, assuming that no other significant contaminant is present. So this is how you will do the risk assessment procedure. So in terms of development of this reference dose, we just now in the previous previous problem, we used a reference dose number for the zinc. How this reference dose number came in. The reference dose numbers comes in from that dose response curve, which you saw earlier in the slide in the presentation. So in terms of the dose response, you have the Novel and Lowell. Novel is the last no observed adverse effect level, and then your Lowell is the lowest observed adverse effect level. So you divide this Novel or Lowell by an uncertainty factor. Why uncertainty factor? Because you are going from animal species to a human species. And there are other things as well, as is listed at the bottom of this slide. There are uncertainty factors, is the data uncertainty, high to low dose extrapolation. And then we have an interspecies extrapolation. You're going from one species to another. Then there are extrapolation between routes of exposure. For protection, then another factor of 10 for protection of sensitive individuals, because for the same, for example, right now, if you have a change in weather, some people catches cough and cold very quickly when there is a change of weather. So for the same change of weather, other person may not catch cough and cold, because different people have different immune system. So some people are sensitive, so to take care of them, we put a protection of 10 over there as well. So if a dose has no adverse effect on a mouse at 0.5 kg per 0.5 milligram per kilogram per day, then divide by 10 to the power of 3 for safe human dose, you get 0.00005 milligram per kilogram per day. So that's how you calculate the RFD. For like a maximum contaminant, like a maximum contaminant level goal for drinking water, for carcinogen and probable carcinogen, we have it 0. For non-carcinogen, we have a drinking water equivalent level divided by the slope factor. So this is what we use for, and the category 3, if you have no carcinogenity, no impact, so you don't have to worry about that. So in terms of how will you calculate this dual and MCLG drinking water limit? So you establish novel from the literature or from the experiment. You calculate your RFD, which is a novel divided by the slope factor. Dual assumes no carcinogenicity and exposure medium in water. So you have RFD, body weight, and the liter of water. For the MCL, this is for carcinogen, we have 0. For this, we assume a food intake besides water. So based on that, you need for MCLG, for whatever is the drinking water number, minus the food contribution, minus the air contribution. So that's what you get for basis. For second type of contaminants, you multiply it by the drinking water contribution. So that's how you calculate it. So again, if you look at this particular in terms of calculation, I will kind of revive, like I will go over this like one more time to make it clear, to give you kind of one more explanation to make it more clearer. We have two categories, you can say 3 categories of pollutants. Category 1 is a known carcinogen or probable carcinogen, for which we don't want any of these to be present in water. For category 2, which is your some sort of impact is there, but no, they are not carcinogens. So there we take the drinking water equivalent level and then divide it by slope factor. Slope factor is essentially your risk factor, your factor of safety. Then category 3, where no evidence of any carcinogenicity, where you have goal is equal to the drinking water equivalent level. So we are at that particular level. So how you do that? You establish novel and lowell from the literature, multiply it by the slope factor, and then you get that number, RFD number. Calculate your drinking water equivalent level based on what is the body weight and the liter of water ingested. For the different categories, you find out, and then water is not the only source. You will have the food contribution and air contribution as well. Similarly, for like the second basis, where like no such impact, you can take in terms of the percentage drinking water contribution from there. So with this, we kind of cover this particular segment of this module, where we have looked at, in terms of like a quick summary, we looked at the basics, very fundamental aspects related to the risk assessment. What is the definition of risk assessment, how we go about it doing for a carcinogenic chemical, non-carcinogenic chemical, how the data come from, and what are the issues, how you go from animal data like rat, guinea pigs, and those data to the human data, and some of the calculations associated with that in terms of the drinking water limit, so drinking water equivalent level, how you can calculate whether something is, you know the dosage, how to calculate the dosage. At the same time, if you know the dosage, how to find out whether it's a safe. You look at your hazard index, you also look at other factors associated with that, and then how come up with your decision. So that summarizes the basics of risk assessment. We will again, on the third module of this particular week, we'll kind of go a little bit more detail on the risk assessment part, but for now, thank you, and keep watching this video.